Welcome back to another episode of the LoCoFit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Laurin and today we have an episode with Rick, our team mental health counselor, to talk about labeling. When is labeling helpful? When is it hurtful? And how to rise above the identity of a label or diagnosis. So I love how we say a full-length episode, even though the last two were supposed to be very short.
Very
and
short,
we have not captured that yet. We have to nail that. Maybe next month we will nail the shorter episodes. I knew that. I was like,
maybe this will be the short one.
This is like the full-length episode.
10 minutes.
It's actually
done.
Long. No, so I thought this would be a really interesting topic to discuss just in like a general sense, because I feel like there are so many times where obviously labeling can be helpful, right? And understanding a diagnosis can be helpful. And whether there is therapy involved or behavioral changes involved or potentially medication involved, that can be life-changing and life-saving for certain people. But I also do feel like there is a dark side and a hurtful side to labeling, or maybe over-labeling, or putting too much emphasis into that, because then somebody could start to identify with that diagnosis, right? And I just feel like this would be a thing to discuss, because I'm starting to see just a lot of things that point to the direction that we needed to have this conversation. Yeah. So let's have at it. Yeah. When do you think it's helpful?
When do I think labeling is helpful? Labeling is helpful when I know the client can actually hear what I'm saying and recognize that the diagnosis is a series of symptoms and that they can use that information to better themselves. That they aren't going to use it as a crutch or a way to cripple themselves or the relationships that they're in, or use it as a way to create excuses for their behaviors and to rationalize their way around what they're doing. I will say this, very, very, very rarely have I ever shared a diagnosis with a client.
Really?
Yes. Over the last 10 years, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I actually told somebody what their diagnosis was. And it didn't come from me volunteering the information. It was like they were so compelled to find out that I explored, all the needs and reasons why somebody would want to know their diagnosis. But obviously, look, if you guys want to get technical about it from a legal perspective, sure, somebody is that's your therapist. They would eventually be compelled to share with you whatever their official diagnosis was, if they actually have one for you. Some people don't necessarily need a diagnosis. And what I mean by that is I'll see people sometimes who are like, look, I'm coming to you for relationship problems, or having anxiety, or I'm having depression. You might have some criteria or some symptoms of a particular diagnosis, but I might not diagnose that with you, because it's just like, okay, I understand that this is a situation that's creating some of this stuff. Not necessarily a symptom of long-term issues. If a person's got a relationship disorder or relationship issues, I'm looking at the relationship and I'm evaluating the human being, the person that's in front of me, and trying to assess where are the behavioral issues that we need to develop? What are the skills that need to develop? I'm not necessarily listening to the person going oh, well, they're clearly borderline. And, obviously certain things will come up. They'll say things. There's cues that I'll listen to, that I'll hear and be like, okay, this person is definitely trending in this direction, and these are different ways to adjust treatment and go about it. But for the most part, people don't care necessarily about what the diagnosis is.
See, I feel like a lot of people are caring more lately, which is why I wanted to bring this up. Or maybe this has just happened to be what I've been seeing. But a lot of people, posting, hey, late diagnosis in life, I have this, or I have that, or I'm, I finally was diagnosed here. And they're sharing stuff about that, right? And that's kind of where I've started to see this come up. And I think it was a really great point that you mentioned. Okay, it can be useful to have a label when you're not going to do those other things,
right?
When you're not going to say, oh, because of my this or because of my that, this is why I'm acting a certain way. And I think that it's important to understand that, to understand where the root of something is coming from, but that doesn't mean that it allows you to stay in that place, right? Everybody knows, I always talk about the personality research stuff. I think it's just super fascinating. I just love it. And you can look at all those things and you can say, okay, I'm this, I'm on a scale of this, or I'm a percentile of that, or I have this proclivity towards acting this way. And that helps you understand yourself and how you act around other people. But it doesn't mean because you have certain negative traits that allows you to, I'm highly neurotic. I know you're probably really surprised, right? Act really surprised. Right?
What?
No way.
Stop. You.
Okay, not that much acting. But me hearing that, it doesn't necessarily change anything. It makes me understand, oh, okay, certain behaviors or certain thoughts that I have, okay, this makes sense. But it doesn't give me a pass to act a certain way just because I fall in that category. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes it can be helpful to people to recognize, oh, hey, maybe I do have these thought patterns, or maybe I do fit this criteria. But also I don't need this to be my identity.
Correct.
And that's where I think it can get harmful. And that's just why I wanted to bring this up, because I think a lot of people can cling to that. And not to say that it becomes this negative mindset around it. And I just don't really know how, and that's where I don't know, this isn't my expertise, like how to get beyond that, essentially.
Yeah. So part of it when we use when you can use your diagnosis as an excuse for your behaviors and not really address or adjust anything around it, you're doing yourself and the people around you a disservice. I had a friend of mine who was dating a guy who had ADHD, and he was on ADHD medication. And, she would be talking to him at dinner, and he would be like on his phone or doing something different. And she would be like, "You're not listening to a word I'd say." And he'd look up and he goes, "Well, I have ADHD." That's not an excuse. And so there's a perfect example of somebody who's using the diagnosis as an excuse to not focus, to like put your phone down, to set better boundaries, to do different things, to create a space where it's like, it's one thing the idea would be, if I'm going to tell you your diagnosis and I'm going to share that with you, the idea is that you're using that as a way to use it as kind of like a checks and balances against what your behaviors are, to become more aware, not less aware, not cripple you, but to become more aware, to be like, okay, if I have ADHD, and let's just say I'm attention focused. So I know that I have difficulty following instructions and completing tasks that require mental effort. And I know what my characteristics are of this particular disorder, right? So me knowing that, how am I strategically planning to address those things? What can I do to pay more attention? Can I eliminate outside noises and distractions? Can I find a better environment to study in or to engage with these people in? What are the ways, the behaviorals, the skills, the things that I can do to minimize all the other things that feed into this? Why? Because I'm aware of what I have. And I'm not using it as an excuse. I'm using that as knowledge to assess and change my behaviors and what I'm doing and how I'm interacting within the relationships and myself, so that I don't have this. Because if the idea was to come to therapy to get a diagnosis, to have an excuse for the way that you are, you can get that after 1 or 2 sessions with most people. I mean, just go to a psychiatrist and, pay your whatever $100, they'll diagnose you. They'll give you some pills to go with it too. And then you can be on your merry way and you don't have to change or do anything.
Would you say that most psychiatry visits end with prescription?
Most. It's the biggest issue that I have with it, is they're seeing people for 10 or 15 minutes. They're listening to your symptoms, not addressing things on a day-to-day basis. They don't have complete histories. They aren't talking to you about your problem solving, your coping mechanisms, the underlying traumas that might be causing these things, the long litany of history that might be contributing to this stuff. You're just going in and you're basically saying, look, I've got low energy. I haven't been feeling like myself lately. I tend to think about things in more negative tones. And, on occasion when I am in the public, I get pretty nervous. Okay, well, you might be suffering with some social anxiety and depression. Let me give you some Zoloft. Let me give you some Xanax. And then, boom, out the door, see me in 30 days. Right? By the time I get to a 30-day space with a client, it's usually because I know everything that's been going on with them. We've been seeing each other for weeklies. It's been kicked back to a bi-weekly where now they're having more space to practice and work on the skills. And we're taking bi-weekly to monthly where it's like, okay, this is a check-in for a few months. And then you're kind of off on your own. Psychiatry isn't all bad. I don't want to paint that picture.
Yeah, there's certainly great psychiatrists, and that wasn't the point of my comment, but I was just curious.
I think they're too quick to write prescriptions, and let's be honest, I think people are going there looking for prescriptions too. People are looking for the quick fix. They're looking for the pill that I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm lonely. Give me something so that I don't feel sad anymore. And they do, they take it, they feel a little bit better. But what did you do to address the underlying feelings and emotions that were creating the sadness? What new skills did you develop? What insights did you gain? None? Well, then what are you doing? You're crippling your ability to cope. We've lost the ability as a society to cope effectively with negative situations that are developing in our life. And that's where I think psychiatry hurts more than it helps. But as far as people identifying through their diagnosis and where it becomes negative, is that if you tell somebody, hey, you're bipolar, and the person uses the diagnosis as a way to not grow, to not change, to use it as an excuse for their behaviors, and even worse, that now the expectation is that everyone around them has to adjust to their diagnosis because they're now special. And what I think sometimes happens is people use their diagnosis as the sole purpose for their identity, as a way to find meaning and value in who they are. Like, oh, I'm this. And so like they can put a label on it and they can feel something, special almost in a way. And it's like attaching yourself almost to like a movement rather than understanding like this is the byproduct of all the other stuff that has usually happened in your life. And now that we know what you are, how are you growing from it? And they're not. And so the people that oftentimes are seeking out the diagnosis, I'm trying to evaluate what's their motivation behind knowing it. And I will share that with them. I will tell people flat out, I think you'll use this as an excuse for you to do things that, you just don't want to change. And here are the reasons why. Other people where you're like, they're driven, they're motivated, they're taking notes, they're practicing the skills. Like for them, sometimes hearing the diagnosis can be a relief. Because to them, it's like, oh my God, I knew something was off. I knew I wasn't right, but hearing that makes sense. These symptoms, the thought process, the behaviors, this aligns with who I am and who I've been. Like, it can be a relief for that person to hear their diagnosis. But those are the people who are like, great, now how do I get better? Mm-hmm. How do I take this and grow?
It's not a transient thing either, which I think is important because what you touched on in the beginning, I think anybody could walk into any therapist's office at any point and have anxiety, depression, yes, obsessive thoughts, ADHD, all these different things. Obviously, there's varying degrees, and I'm not minimizing these diagnoses, but I'm saying that we all can go through these periods of time. And if you're just going to a psychiatrist on a very anxious week, like if I saw a psychiatrist last week, or really any week, let's be honest, there would be a whole laundry list of meds I'd be walking out with. But I'm joking about it, but not really. Because honestly, if I were just to go in there, and here's the thing, I know enough that I could say, I would know exactly what to say to get exactly what I needed. Right. And I know a lot of people who would be able to do that as well. Mm-hmm. And I could walk in there if I said, you know what, I would really like this. I could say anything to fit that criteria. Correct. Because it's not that hard when somebody isn't asking, all this background information. They're only seeing you for 10 to 15 minutes and they're only seeing you at one time point, whereas, typically when we're talking about more, talk-based therapy, it's going to be over several weeks and you're trying to identify a diagnosis, not just on a particular day or particular week, but okay, how long you've been feeling like this? Is this a whole lifelong thing? Is this something that's developed out of something else? Is this really the root issue? What should we be working on? So I think that it can be a relief for certain people. And again, not to knock medication whatsoever. Some people do need that and it's a huge benefit in their life, but that's usually not the first defense, or it shouldn't be the first defense, because then you're not able to really work on certain things. And again, there's going to be situations where clearly medication is needed right away. I'm not trying to say that that's not the case, but that also doesn't mean that the other work doesn't still need to happen, right? Because typically, whether you get a label or a diagnosis or medication, whatever it is, those things are still going to be there, but they might be subdued or managed better. But those thought patterns are still going to be there. Your negative coping mechanisms are still going to be there. So even if you do have, ADD, ADHD, and maybe you are on medication, you're still going to be somebody who's going to be a little bit more distracted. You're still going to be somebody who struggles focusing and completing certain tasks. How are we going to manage that is the biggest thing. And the medication can be really, really helpful, but it's not the only thing. Right. It's like, that's not the only thing that's going to be helping you. And what happens if one day you didn't take it or you run out or something? There's always going to be things, right? And then it's, so it's one of those things where it's like, okay, we have to figure out how to work your life around this and not just because, okay, well, now I have this and now I understand myself. That's step one. Step one is understanding your thought patterns and why things are a certain way and teasing that out and figuring out, okay, this is helping, this is hurting. But now what else are we going to do? Like we actually have to develop these skills. And from a lot of the people too, that I always talk about, Andrew Huberman and different neuroscience people, and like the increase rate of ADD and ADHD diagnoses, right? It's just like, is everybody have this now? Is it a byproduct of everybody's lifestyle? Is this right? Like, but seriously, like, is this what is happening? Right? Because something is happening clearly. Right. And whether or not it's true ADD or ADHD, or if it's a 10-minute diagnosis or whatever it is, people are experiencing these side effects.
Right.
And is it all lifestyle? Is it all neurochemical? Is it both? Like what is going on here? But I would say that first and foremost, regardless of any type of medication, you need to be able to sit with your thoughts. You need to be able to examine what you should be doing, what makes things worse, what makes things better. Because I think people always want to focus on like, okay, well, what makes me feel better? But it's like also there are many things that you're doing that make yourself feel worse.
Right.
And that is almost as important, if not more important, I've found, at least for myself with so many things, like, okay, this actually like this is actively making me worse when I do this. And like that has a lot more power than the positive things.
Right.
So it's like, okay, need to figure this out.
Knowing what not to do is just as important as knowing what to do. And that's a valuable lesson for a lot of people to learn in life, because I completely agree. Is the number rising? I think there's a lot of, I think it is rising. And part of my issue, some of the things that I've seen with it is in the past, it wasn't that popular of a diagnosis. Like if you were to go back 20 years ago even, right? Not everybody was being diagnosed. It was like, it wasn't a common thing. And it's like, as mental health has increased in awareness and functionality, and the stigma of seeing a mental health professional has greatly decreased, there's been a greater level of acceptance, which is awesome. That also comes with an increase in general knowledge that the public has. And I think sometimes people are looking for, instead of just saying like this person's just a little wild and they might have these things, they might be a little unruly and hyper and all that kind of stuff, we're looking to categorize their behavior in a diagnosis. We're looking to say, oh, well, they're clearly ADHD and we need to get this kid medicated. It's like, if you were to go back to when I was a kid, I was a wild terror. If you were to have taken me as a 10 or 12-year-old to a psychiatrist or a mental health professional, somebody would have said, Rick has ADHD. And they probably would have told my mom to prescribe medications. Now, maybe that would have helped. Maybe my grades in school as a kid would have been a little bit better. I didn't take academics seriously until I really started to get into college. But the idea of it is I also outgrew it. I developed the ability to sustain attention, to focus on details, to complete tasks, to do things that required mental effort. The difference was I started to find things that were intriguing to me and found outlets for more of my energy. Nowadays, we take like small children, we shove them in a classroom for 8 hours a day. They barely get an hour outside for recess. And the expectation is that this 7-year-old is going to sit quietly, read, study, do nothing with their energy levels. And then when they start being a disruption in class, we're like, kid's clearly ADHD. Or
they're put in front of electronics, which are obviously going to take all of their attention because that sucks in anybody's attention, regardless if you have ADHD or not. And then as soon as that's taken away, then there's all these other negative consequences. And people are wondering why. It's like, well, of course, we see this with adults too. So why would we not see this in children? Yeah. And so you're having the kids who are not being active, but then you're putting them in front of all of these screens and all these different things. It's like, what good is going to come out of this?
Yeah.
Like, there's not a lot. I'm not saying a lot of positives there.
No, there isn't. I mean, it just creates, it feeds into something that's already growing. If people are struggling with attention, and we're going to give you a device that specifically draws your attention to it, right? Like, I've had conversations with full-grown adults where they're putting, their phones in their hand. And you're talking to them, and as soon as a text message comes through, like, your conversation doesn't exist anymore, and they're like immediately drawn to it. And it's like, you're an adult. Put the fucking phone down. Engage in this conversation, please. And don't get me wrong, I am guilty of doing that from time to time too. This isn't about, judging people for stuff like that, but we all can do better when it comes to this stuff. And there's so many other things, like, holistically, that we want to look at, and from a person's perspective, like, if a person's going to see a psychiatrist, is that psychiatrist recommending that, hey, what are you doing for coping mechanisms, and who else are you talking to, and what's your support system look like, and tell me about your diet and your fitness level and your overall activity, and how often do you read, what kind of books do you read, like, what's your childhood been like, what level of trauma exposure has this person had,
and you can't do that with one session.
You can't do that in 10 minutes.
No.
Diagnosing, for me, is fluid. It is something that is constantly happening over time. And furthermore, one of the other things that I really want people to understand about a diagnosis, and where my trepidation comes in sharing it with people, is that I don't want to view you as just a diagnosis. I want to view you as a whole person, not just somebody who's like borderline or narcissistic or generalized anxiety or whatever the situation is, or just post-traumatic stress disorder. This person's all PTSD. Well, what am I seeing then? I'm only seeing intrusive thoughts. I'm only seeing the arousal symptoms. I'm only seeing the avoidance patterns. I'm seeing the derealization or depersonalization, whatever it is. And you go down this rabbit hole with it. But I'm missing everything else that makes them a human being. I'm missing their passions, their hopes, their dreams, their ambitions in life. I'm missing the things that are valuable and meaningful to them because I'm only funneling everything through this one lens. And what happens when we've addressed the PTSD and they're not having nightmares or flashbacks or they're not reliving the trauma? Now what? That's it? No, that's fine. Maybe that's the end of therapy. Okay, great. I'm not having panic attacks anymore. Thanks, Rick. Like, life is good. Cool. Move on. But for most people, that's not the end all be all, because to me, what caused the PTSD? Where was it? Where did it arrive from? If you don't want to go down that hole, fine. We don't have to. It's your money. You get to pay for the services, I guess, that you really want. But you're missing all the other aspects of their life. And if you miss that, you're also missing the other cues, triggers, and motivations for them to get better. Right? This has been affecting you, but have you thought about the impact that this has on your son or your daughter or your wife or your husband or the people that you work with? The impact that you're having. Is this how you want to be remembered? Is this how you want people to feel when you walk into a room? Right? You ever have those people where like you're having a great day and they walk into a room and immediately your stomach tightens or there's tension that fills in your body and you're just like, you're on guard. You almost become hypervigilant to this person. Like there's a sign that this is an unhealthy relationship and an unhealthy person. How many people are aware enough to know that they have that impact on other people?
And it was I don't know when this is going to come out in relation to the interview, but I did an interview with my friend and we were talking about coaching, but we were talking about how, so say a client is sharing a situation, right? That, maybe the situation was they went on vacation, they fell off their diet. We've seen that 100 times, right? We probably know exactly what they did, but them telling it, right, in their own words, instead of us saying, hey, I probably know what happened, right? This. Because you have, as the coach or the trainer or the therapist, whatever, you already want to fill in the blanks because you've seen this a million times. You're like, I kind of have an idea. But them being able to share it, number one, allows them to actually voice that, allows them to process it a little bit better, but also now gives you a little bit of a clue and a different spin on it because it might have been a little bit different, right? It might have been the same kind of idea that you thought, but now you're not just viewing them as somebody who fell off their plan on vacation. They're actually telling you the exact reason why and the step-by-step process. And that could have been different than what you were actually thinking. So instead of just viewing it as, oh, somebody who you weren't adherent this week, like non-adherent client, right? Or somebody who has anxiety, like you're just writing off everything else and you're only seeing things through that lens. Whereas if you're actually getting to the root of the issue or hearing the situation, then you're able to actually help them in a more personalized way. And that's where true one-on-one connection and change is going to be able to happen. Because otherwise, you're pretty anxious. Okay, here you go. What's that going to do? Like that's not going, that might be somewhat useful. Oh, okay. But that's really not going to give anybody any room to grow from that. Right. What's so challenging is like like I said, on social media, like you just start to see, and I'm so happy that there's been a big push with destigmatizing mental health and going to therapy and doing all this, like so excited with all this stuff. And there's a lot more resources and education online. Love it. But there's also, if you're this, you might have these symptoms, or these are signs of undiagnosed whatever, or this is, it is rampant. And I think it's like WebMD amplified, and it's never with a pretty graphic. Good. Yeah. Right. And it's like, this is how here's some uncommon things. And then it's like, let us know in the comments how you are. And then of course it becomes this echo chamber of all these things. And then it becomes literally like, what symptom isn't in here? You know what I mean? Like you could basically have everything. So, okay, what is this helping? Like, this is not helpful now because now we're just putting this label on something and saying, oh, this is why I was feeling this way, but not doing the work associated with figuring out how to not feel that way. Exactly. And it becomes almost not a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe it's more just like a kind of an echo chamber. It's kind of what I'm thinking of. Like when you see things, again, all these pretty graphics. So here, this symptom, signs, this, that, you might have this. Oh, I have all these things. Oh my gosh. And then you become why do I have all these things? What is wrong with me? Am I ever going to get better? And then it becomes this like a nihilistic spin. Correct. And I don't think anybody reads stuff like that and feels better. Like nobody's like, oh, wow. Like you're just like, oh, fuck. Do I have this? Do I have that?
Right.
What am I going to do? Oh my gosh, should I go? And then it becomes, for most people, this spiral of, more anxiety and intrusive thoughts and all of this. And then you just kind of replay in your head over and over again this laundry list of symptoms. Instead of saying, okay, maybe I do have all these symptoms. Maybe I do have multiple labels or diagnoses or whatever, but that's not my identity. And how do I become a person who's not that? You know what I mean? Like, right. I'm not anxiety. I might have anxiety. I am not anxiety. Correct. I might have depression. I might have intrusive thoughts. I might have OCD. That's not me as an individual.
Right.
So how do I rise above that? It's by creating better coping mechanisms and figuring out what makes you better, what makes you worse, and what to avoid.
Well, and
who to avoid.
That's the switch. You're looking at it and saying, like, I have these things, they're a part of me, but it's not me. Versus the people who are saying, like, this is me. I have these symptoms, and this is who I am. That's you taking the diagnosis and truly it becoming your identity. And there's a difference, because one of the things we've talked about this before, like becoming a whole person. And it also means that, yes, some of these aspects are a part of who you are, but there's so many other aspects of who you are too, that I want to look beyond that. It's not just showing up and, talking to somebody in whatever capacity it is, as a coach, as a doctor, as a physician, as a mental health professional. You're going to this person, and yes, they can categorize this one aspect of who you are into something, or categorize this aspect of who you are, but it is not who you are as an individual. There's so much more about you that matters equally, if not more, than some of these things. And we lose sight of that. And what you were kind of hinting around at is exactly what I've talked about therapy being. There's the why, right? There's two parts to therapy: the why I am the way that I am, and what happened and created this space for me to be where I am today. And then there's the second part: what now? Right? So if you get a diagnosis, or your therapist has told you, not everybody, handles this the same way, but if you're like, okay, I've got this diagnosis, that's the why. That's the part one. This is what I do. These are some behaviors, some signs, some symptoms, all that. What now? What are you going to do with this information? How are you going to develop skills and create strategies and develop new plans to address these things? What behavior changes are you going to do? What are you going to do to address this with your family, to recognize it, to acknowledge it, to own it, to better yourself from it? Right? And not only just bettering yourself, it's bettering the relationships that are around you. So there's a very different approach in those two clients. There's people who are looking to use it as a crutch to hold them back, to finally validate who they are and use it as an excuse to rationalize their crappy behavior and who they are and not grow from it and just expect you to deal with it. I'm bipolar. I'm borderline. I'm histrionic. I have PTSD. I live through trauma. Like, I'm just a traumatized person. Like, if this is who you are.
Well, and then that can go into a whole different rabbit hole of, like, if that is who you are identifying as, like, that is what you are going to attract. Mm-hmm. If you're only identifying with those negative things, that is who you're going to be. And that can be not even just something as extreme as this.
It's a victim mindset.
Yeah, but this is even, and I've talked about, like meditating and all these different things, right? I always used to say, I'm not a meditator. I'm not a meditator. I'm not going to be a meditator if I continuously tell myself that I'm not.
Right.
With this podcast, I was always, I love podcasts. I want to be better at this, but I was always like, I'm not good at this. I'm not good at it. And then I would let that hold me back from doing certain things because, I'm not good at this. I just do it. It's just a small thing. And I'm always writing it off as like this.
Minimizing it, making it less significant.
No, if I want to be good at this, I have to say that, no, I want to be a good podcaster. Mm-hmm. Not going to be the best one right away. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm not going to set myself up to think in that negative sense.
Right. And
so I think that, of course, those are way less significant than other things that we're talking about here. But I think it does speak true to really all of that. You know what I mean? Like if you become, I am a trauma victim, that is very important to recognize. It's important to understand why it happened, how to not ever have that happen again, hopefully. What are you going to do next? Right. And not just living in that space, because then, and you've seen this too, and we talked a little bit about this with like the alcoholic podcast, like that becomes basically the reality, and like that kind of fuels the next steps for people, right? Like, and you get stuck in those behaviors, or like if you're dating people who are always narcissistic or whatever, or in any kind of toxic relationship, and you end up staying in that situation because that's what's familiar to you. And so it can go into all these different categories, and not just necessarily like a label for you, but like even what you're attracted to and what you do. So I think that it's important to just be able to recognize these things and rise above that label, so to speak, because that is not necessarily just who you are. You're a lot of other things.
Yes.
And there are negative things about you too. Like those are true too, right? You can't just say like, oh, I'm just all these great things. Like, no, there's shitty things about you too. And you should also recognize and understand those, because if you don't, and you just live in this like place that I'm so great, well then that's not reality either. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of positives about you, and there's also a lot of negatives, but those are things that you can identify and work on, instead of just saying, oh, well, a lot of my negative traits are because of this.
Right.
That's a great first step. We need to get there, because if you don't have that awareness, you're never going to be able to work through it. But like you said, okay, now what? And that's definitely the part that I think people probably leave therapy once they figured out, okay, I've identified some of these patterns, and then they're kind of like, yeah, I got it. And then they're like, well, this is actually where the real work starts. And that's the really uncomfortable part. And that's the part that is slow. That's the part that's going to, overcoming, whether it's like limiting beliefs or, just behaviors that you've done your entire life that are counterproductive, or just situations you found yourself in. Like, those are not going to be easy to work through. There's going to be a different time frame for every single person. Right. But if you don't do that, what is the alternative?
Yeah, when you're starting to change and challenge patterns that have existed, that are well-worn paths in your mind and in your behaviors and the way that you approach life, the way that you perceive events, changing somebody's perception of an event, like logically on paper, sounds easy, right? But it's different when you're automatically, like, what does automatic mean? Like, you're not even thinking about it. It's happening on a subconscious or unconscious level, that you're making those things. And so for a lot of people, the work is in recognizing, okay, I've made this leap, I've done this stuff. Now I've got to go back and do the work and realize, like, okay, how could I have interpreted this differently? And to allow that to become part of the thought process. And that's you not being a victim anymore. That's you being a survivor. That's you being a champion for your own cause. That's you saying, look, I'm not only putting my health, my family in front of just my need to feel comfortable. And so that's a bigger space for people to be in. Some people do it really well and they adapt to the changes. Other people, it's a struggle. It's a lifelong struggle for people. Sometimes it's never anything. People are like, I don't want this. Okay, great. I agree. You don't want that. I don't want that for you. But your ability to change some of these things, it might not just ever become secondhand nature. You might have to think about it. And that's just the way you've developed as a human being. You can't change that, but you can change the years to come and the results and the outcomes that develop as a result of that. And so for people who are looking to make this change, like, how do I make that change? Number one, what's your motivation for wanting the diagnosis, right? Now, sometimes, again, some people are like, God, I feel good to hear that. Like, I know that. And they can incorporate it into their lives and they want to start sharing about it. And I encourage people to share their stuff with their family, especially the ones who are going to interact with them, because they can not necessarily detach, but understand it better. Like, oh, well, this is mom doing these things because this is this. But mom, you mentioned that when you're doing this, you want us to do this, right? So sometimes you've got to teach the people around you to react to you differently in order to help hold you accountable. And that is like, oh man, that sucks, because now the rest of the family also has to get involved. You have to share. It can't be in the dark anymore, and it's accepting it. But if your motivation is to use it as an excuse, to be a crutch for you not to grow, not to change, then I don't know. I don't know what good you're going to get out of therapy.
Yeah, I think that the label of a diagnosis, or just recognizing any of these thought patterns, is going to be the first step. But it's the first step of many. And it's not where things stop. No. It's uncovering, okay, where do I need to do this work? Where do I need to shift my behaviors? But that is literally just where things are beginning. Yeah. So don't stop there. Right. You can rise above this. And like we said, this is not the only part of you. It is a single part of you. And there's many other great things that, like you said, are probably even better. And equally, if not more important than just your diagnosis. This is an aspect of who you are, and it can change. It is not permanent. It's not who you are. So we'll leave it with that. So thank you guys so much for listening. I will put in Rick's contact information below in the show notes, as well as the link to the anonymous Google form so you guys can submit questions for us. For more information on one-on-one coaching, visit teamlocofit.com and be sure to join our email list for great information and to be the first to hear more about the app we will be releasing in a few months.